it was very interesting to be in school in the late 80s up to the early 90s when Frank Gehry was really kind of starting launching some of the most interesting parts of his practice. And he was known as he was inventing technologies. He was working with airplane modeling companies to transform his own buildings into something that was built. But I was at Columbia with Bernard Tschumi and gone there to kind of study with him. And his Bernard was all about, telling the story and kind of thinking about film and thinking about how architecture is about a passage through time and space. And Frank Gehry was just the complete opposite. It was really just about the thing that he had just made with his hands. It could have been a piece of paper, but it could have also been a piece of cardboard that was then kind of remodeled and kind of pulled back together. And there was something really kind of urgent and organic about the making part, but it was also as a student, for me, it was very kind of opaque because I didn't have his hands and wasn't doing it he was doing. So it was hard to understand how that translates into, how my crumpled piece of paper would be either compared to Frank Gehry's or would not, or how I could aspire to have some of his skills. So in some ways he was a really unusual and a fascinating, but also some ways a kind of frustrating from the student perspective, a figure in architecture. But obviously very, very interesting to kind of follow. And the earliest article that I've read about him was from 1981 when he was 52 years old, and it was the first article that came out in the AA files about Gehry. And Peter Cook wrote the article. He was the founder of Archigram, major architectural figure in London, and he basically called Gehry the youngest of the. He was obviously age-wise the oldest, but the youngest of the young architects in Los Angeles, and kind of talks about going into his house and just seeing, a family of three with ripped up furniture and everything, like these models all around. So anyway, there was something really kind of very, very important, obviously, to his work in the idea of making, but also something that made it very hard for anybody else to even kind of build on.
To your point, John, when I was watching that film and I was watching him work, it's what really overwhelmed me was that he came at the materials like an artist, as opposed to somebody who's got to make something physically work as a structure. It just the way he held things up and moved things around, and it's the same way you experiment when you're approaching a canvas. And quite often, for artists, you make a mistake and it's something that you thought, oh, I better erase that. And you look and you say, oh, wait, that's better than what I was intending to do. Let me see if I follow that, where that's going to go. And so you see him working with crumple, not just even folded paper, but crumpled paper, and doing different things.
So
There,
before we leave this, right, a couple of thoughts, because John reminded me, there were conversations as we went through the process, there were conversations about the difference between a craftsman and an architect. And that in Frank's mind, and this was true of Craig Webb too, who was the second on our job, they would talk about how it would be better for everyone if the craftsman and the architect were one and the same. Because if you really understood how you were going to do what you were imagining, you'd get there, it would be more elegant, you'd get there more quickly, all would be better. Now, that's obviously not the case. And we were in a situation there where he was using digital. Frank says that this is the first building that he did that was digital from start to finish, not a pencil touched a page. So he was so far away from this craftsman architect relationship, and yet it was still foremost in his mind. I think it's important to realize how he imagined bringing things into his imagination and then actually causing them to happen. One other thought for you about pretension. What Clyde said was absolutely true, but the message he delivered to us in the second session. So we would fly to Los Angeles and we would spend 2 days in the studio and then we'd turn around and come back. The second time we did that, he could feel us withdrawn, being reticent. And he stopped the meeting and he said, "This is the deal, guys. You challenge me. The more you challenge me, the better this building will be. I expect it of you." And we looked at each other and tried to bring ourselves up to what that meant. And I will never forget the red eye back from Los Angeles that time. And I kept thinking, how is this working? How do I challenge Frank Gehry? The answer ultimately was to go back to the program that we had was so well defined. Frank, this is what we want to do. How are we going to do that? So he invited it, no pretension, and we finally figured out how to supply it.
And I
So oh, sorry, go ahead, Clyde.
and building off of that, I think that um I think people may have this idea of, Frank Gehry is like this artist that just, figures out something on the fly and then it gets turned into a building. But in our experience, it's nothing could be farther from the truth. We worked together for years, meticulously designing what the building was supposed to do. What must this building accomplish? And what are all of the different scenarios that we might find ourselves facing? And how can this building, so these are all the different things that this building must do for us. And only then was it, okay, then let me take all that information and then figure out what I can, how this can be accomplished in an aesthetic way, in some sort of interesting way. But it started with so much of that work of defining the program, as Howard said, and all of the things that we needed the building to be before any of that other stuff could happen.